I'm joined by Rob Henderson. Rob is a student of human nature. He is a writer. He focuses on psychology, on social class, and on success. And he is the father of the concept of luxury beliefs, which has been talked about a lot in our circles. So, welcome and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
Excellent. So, one thing that I really love about your work is your newsletter. So that's one thing people should sign up for. It's a newsletter all around human nature, and it goes really deep into evolutionary psychology. And there's always some mind blowing tidbit in in your newsletter. So, what's the exact name of the newsletter?
Uh, I don't really have a firm name for it. I think on my website or on the link, it's like the Rob Henderson newsletter. But it does center on this theme of human nature, and it's just sort of a eclectic collection of essays, centered, like you said, on evolutionary psychology, philosophy, history, sociology, whatever I've been thinking about that week.
Okay, perfect. I mean, definitely everyone check it out. I mean, it's something I've been reading weekly, and I think what we share is this fascination with evolutionary psychology and kind of the insights that it offers to our modern existence. Because a lot of the stuff that we hear nowadays is about social construction and about how a lot of the phenomena that we see are downstream from society, downstream from ways of living that have been instantiated by power structures, either historically or currently. And kind of evolutionary psychology offers in a way, the opposite view. It's like, okay, there are things deep inside you that are that have been there for a long time and that act in certain ways that might be predictable. And I think what people usually say regarding that is that you don't want to fall into the naturalistic fallacy to say that if you have certain tendencies as a human or certain patterns, you don't want to say, okay, this is how it has to be. I'm curious what you think is the limit between these two, because these are two really opposing views. You can either be someone who believes that, okay, humans are instinctive creatures. We act on patterns that are built into our evolutionary matrix or our makeup, or it's social construction and kind of how, as an individual, it's for me. I know it's kind of weird to think about this stuff because I observe these patterns in myself, and the more I understand evolutionary psychology, the more I see them in me and in society. But kind of how do you deal with that on an individual level? Like, what should your perspective be? Like, is an instinct less of an instinct if you know about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, like you said, evolutionary psychology does tend to focus on, sort of more, this word is controversial, but some more innate drives and instincts and behaviors and intuitions and so on that humans tend to share. I think those are important to understand just because so you mentioned the naturalistic fallacy that just because things tend to be a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how they should be. But I think that if you have an idea of how things should be, you should at first understand, before you get to that step, at least understand how things are. And if you want to understand how things are, I think evolutionary psychology is a useful lens to understand that. Um, but your point about whether we should, I guess, like to the extent that self knowledge is useful, or is it useful? Understanding these patterns within ourselves, why we act in certain ways, the social dynamics that we have, maybe with our partners or our friends or our parents or whatever. Um, I think, at least for me, I'm semi optimistic that they can help. Uh, but some people are more pessimistic. Something that just came to mind was this interview. I think this was a couple of years ago with Sam Harris and Daniel Kahneman. And Sam Harris asked Kahneman, who's he wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. He's sort of like the originator of this idea of cognitive biases, or at least one of them. And so Sam Harris asked him, since you know all about cognitive bias and how our attention can be captured and hijacked and so on, you know, are you better able to overcome those biases? And Kahneman responded, oh, not at all. Like, just because you're aware of them, just because you sort of know about them and so on, doesn't necessarily mean you'll like internalize it and recognize it and sort of overcome all of those biases. Um, I guess I'm more optimistic than that, but I don't think you can fully overcome it. Like, just because, for example, you know that when you feel a certain sensation in your stomach and you're hungry, you think, well, that's hunger. Suddenly, the hunger doesn't go away. You still feel that, right? And so you can sort of feel all the other kinds of drives in our social lives, in our romantic lives too. Just because you understand it doesn't mean it suddenly vanishes. Um, but yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this other part of evolutionary psychology too. He was like the biologist E.O. Wilson said something like that genes hold culture on a leash, meaning that you know basically we are sort of innately, to some extent, imprisoned by our biology, and so you can't build a certain different kinds of cultures based on that. There are limitations to what you can do. But I've also been thinking in the opposite direction too, that culture holds genes on a leash, or culture can hold biology on a leash. I mean, some of our uh, tendencies and behaviors and impulses are not particularly flattering, and culture can be one way to constrain those or redirect those impulses. So I think it goes both ways. I'm not like fully this kind of Darwinian person where all of our drives are how they are and we should do anything about it. I think there are clever ways that culture can constrain it too.
Yeah, I think one of the big subjects recently has been the meme of polyamory. Like this is kind of the what's come up, and a lot of people are either polyamorous or experimenting with these lifestyles. I mean, I'm curious from your kind of evolutionarily informed perspective, polyamory as it's seen at the moment. So this would be kind of essentially the free love school of multiple people of different genders dating multiple people with a very kind of contractual basis of who does what. How robust in an evolutionary sense is this lifestyle?
Well, I mean, so if you look at the anthropological research, like one of the most, maybe the most famous piece of work on this is Hierarchy in the Forest by Christopher Baim, I think is how his last name is pronounced. Incredible book, and he basically just sort of outlines how modern day hunter gatherer societies look, how based on the evidence that anthropologists have collected, what they looked like in the past, and essentially what it looks like. And this is just very broad, very roughly speaking here, that um, human societies were more or less monogamous up until, say, the rise of agriculture, maybe 10 or 12,000 years ago. And part of the reason for this is simply because nomadic hunter gatherers or hunter foragers or whatever the term is now for them, you know, basically, if you're moving every so often in search of food, in search of water, in search of whatever, you're not sort of staying in one place. Males can't accumulate vast amounts of wealth. They can't organize large armies. They can't basically collect enough power to dominate others in such a way as to collect many many wives or concubines or whatever. So in those kinds of nomadic societies, usually men had one wife. Sometimes if they were like the big man or like the boss of the community, they might have two or three, but that was somewhat rare. But then with the rise of agriculture, people were able to stay in one place, grow their own food, stockpile resources, money, soldiers, and so on. And then this is when you get like kings and emperors and male, sort of dominant leader types who could then suddenly have hundreds or thousands of wives and create a society such that like you'll have whatever eunuchs to guard and men who you can sort of direct in different directions to basically play on their sexual desires and to go to war to capture or to go to war against other communities, other groups. Um, and then, so more recently, and this is a lot of the work or a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about now come from the book The Weirdest People in the World from the Harvard scientist Joe Henrich. And he's basically said that, like, with the rise of the Western Church and Christianity, this is sort of when things shifted more once again towards monogamy. So actually, for most of our evolutionary history, we're monogamous, and then there was a very, very brief interim where we weren't. So now that we're sort of, I guess, like, maybe I actually don't know the numbers on this. If you would happen to know the numbers, I'd be curious. How many people are polyamorous? I know it's sort of trendy and popular among more prestige media, but at least, like, regular people I know who aren't, like, associated with universities and so on, I don't think it's catching on yet with them. I hope it doesn't. But what have
Yeah.
you heard about its popularity?
To be honest, I mean, I'm just in these circles. I used to work in tech in London, so that was really popular in those circles. Which is like tech in London is kind of a little bit of a carbon copy of Silicon Valley environments. So it's I think it's quite, maybe it's a bit loud because it's amplified for me in those circles. I don't really know the numbers, but I do think because it's, it's espoused by a lot of people, with high status, it does kind of have a chance of morphing into one of them luxury beliefs that you keep talking about. So that's why I'm a bit not concerned, but I've been thinking about, this concept of, having a high caste adopt ideas that, can be, they can adopt them flexibly because they have buffers. They have buffers that, are social buffers, money buffers, reputation buffers, things like that, that people in, lower strata don't have. So yeah, I mean, I feel
Right.
like polyamory for me, this is a bit of a contender there, because at least in the discourse, on Twitter and stuff like that, people, it's amplified, and a lot of push is towards destigmatizing and normalizing things like this. And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's that good of an idea.
Well, so just for the listeners, really, so luxury beliefs, which I'm imagining, like, maybe you've mentioned this idea before, but just to get it out there, the luxury beliefs idea, I've defined it as ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while inflicting costs, oftentimes on the lower classes. And I definitely think that polyamory would be a contender, like you're saying. In one of my luxury beliefs essays, I tell a story. So a friend of mine, he might have graduated recently, but at least at this point, he was attending a pretty, one of these fancy universities, and he was telling me, like, when I go on Tinder, and I set my radius to like 1 mile, just like right around the university, basically. Um, so many of these, like, the women that I match with are students, of course, and something like half of them have, like, open relationship, poly, sort of no strings, like, basically very sexually open, sexually fluid, whatever, like, not interested in what you might think of as, like, just a typical monogamous relationship. And then he went on to say that when he extended his radius on Tinder to include the rest of the city, which, like, the outskirts of the city are actually like more working class, more poor people, um, then he started to see profiles of young women, and he said about half of them were single moms. And to me, this is uh, quite a stark example of a luxury belief, such that the sort of beliefs that are broadcast by the former, i.e., the class that tends to go to elite universities, trickle down and over time influence the behavior of the latter, of these young working class women who, like you're saying, they don't have the same amount of social capital, cultural capital, uh, access resources, and so on to withstand uh, a sort of sexually promiscuous lifestyle. And not only that, I mean, I haven't talked as much about this, but I've been thinking more about this too. Is that, like, you know, I guess I don't know if this would count as social capital necessarily, but the kinds of people who are around them. Look, I grew up with these kind of guys too. So for better or worse, if you're a young woman at an elite university, the kinds of guys you're fooling around with or whatever, like, if something were to happen, they're more likely to help you out. Whereas, a lot of, like, poor working class males, if something were they're not going to necessarily be the most helpful people in emergency situations. So that is another sort of aspect of this too, romantic capital, however you want to put it, that the guys you're fooling around with, they may also not be ideal in certain circumstances, depending on your social class.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like if you were to kind of go back to maybe like the '60s, even the '50s, depending on how attentively you want to look at the data, I think the sexual revolution itself, in certain ways, and kind of that plus the pill, which was kind of like the technological amplifier or enabler of the sexual revolution to kind of let it run its course. I feel like that was one of the not the first dominoes. There are many dominoes in history, but at least for the first dominoes for a lot of stuff that we now call, dysfunction in the dating market. So I'm curious because you talk a lot about kind of these kind of almost like game theoretical dynamics between men and women. When there are more men than women in a situation, kind of the game theory of the dating market shifts and the other way around. I'm curious what you see like the impact of the birth control pill was because there's this really interesting essay by Heather McDonald, and I refer to it a lot. It's the kind of the sexual default essay, where once the sexual revolution hit, once the pill became common and everyone was taking it, it became kind of the onus was put on women to say no to sex rather than no to sex being kind of the standard in society, saying okay, no sex before marriage is that's probably what we all agree to do, but there's going to be some defectors. Some people will be married and have a baby while they're at the wedding ceremony, but that would kind of be the outliers. So kind of the standard shifted because now why shouldn't you say no to sex because you're a free woman. You have the pill, you're completely empowered. So I don't know, that's a lot to put on you, but kind of you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, of course, it's always hard to disentangle, technology and culture and all of these things that might have given rise to these shifts in culture over the last whatever 60 years or so. But yeah, I mean, so one thing I remember the first time I came across this statistic. I mean, it shocked me, and then like when I shared it with other people, like a lot of people ended up sharing it later on. Uh, and this has been documented by both the social scientist Charles Murray as well as the Harvard professor Robert Putnam have both shared data on this, showing that in 1960, uh, working class and upper class parents or families rather. So 95% of children born to upper class and working class families, 95% of them were born to both of their birth parents and lived with both of their birth parents. And then by 2005, for the upper class, it had dropped to 85%. So it was 95%, now it's 85%. So there was a slight dip among the upper class. But for the working class, it was 95% in 1960, and by 2005, it had dropped to 30%. So it was this huge drop off, such that in 1960, families basically looked the same regardless of class. And then by the mid 2000s, it's like two different planets, basically. Um, and perhaps, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the pill had something to do with this. I'm reminded of this study by these Brookings researchers. I can't. They had a name for it too because there were two researchers and this phenomenon was named after them. But um, basically, they collected a bunch of data, a bunch of analysis, and found essentially that reproductive technology may have actually contributed to more broken families, unwanted children, single motherhood. And the idea here was that before there were basically there were a lot of marriages because for men, if they wanted to have sex, they had to get married. They had no choice. So if they wanted, it's just that's what you had to do. And so they were more likely to get married and then have sex and then have children. On the other hand, sometimes there was premarital sex going on back then, but uh, there was this sort of cultural expectation of shotgun marriages. So if a man were to get a woman pregnant and they weren't married, society was set up such that the man was pressured to marry the woman. Okay, but then once the pill appeared on the scene, um, men no longer felt an obligation or a duty to women anymore if they had sex with them. Sort of crudely, the idea was that like if they have sex and the woman gets pregnant, well, it's your fault. Like you didn't have to get pregnant. The default is you don't get pregnant, and if you do, it's that's on you. Why is that my problem? And so the way the researchers put it was that once motherhood became a biological choice for women, then fatherhood became a social choice for men. And it wasn't just the the dynamics between the man and the woman, but also the broader community. So in the past, if a man got a woman pregnant, the neighborhood and the community were like, you need to marry her, you need to take care of her. But once the pill came on the scene, then it was like, well, does he need to stay? She got pregnant. Whose fault was it really? And so it had these sort of trickle down effects. And I always find it interesting, these sort of second order consequences that really I don't think I doubt anyone in 1960 would have thought that way. They just think like, here's this pill. If you go back to like 1955 and you tell people, if you just asked people a question that in the future there will be this sort of magical, inexpensive pill that would, uh, you know, control whether someone got pregnant, whether you would have children. Do you think in the future there will be more single mothers or fewer? Do you think there will be sort of more stable families or fewer orphanages, foster care, whatever? I would imagine, I'd be very surprised if anyone said there would be more, right? I mean, this is pill, it's magic. Why would you have more? But that's not the way things went.
Yeah, absolutely. That just makes me think about all the ways in which technology has helped us decouple kind of our evolutionary trajectory from because there are all sorts of stimuli in our environment that if someone's attractive, then you're kind of almost magnetically attracted to them. If something's sweet, if you see honey, you're like, yeah, I really want that sweet thing. And these are pretty useful things to have in like an ancestral environment where calories are scarce, and you really want to want to mate with the best, the most warrior like guy you can find, and things like that. But now you essentially have the market turning these things around and kind of pointing them at you in almost an aggressive fashion. Like you have, everything has supernormal stimuli baked in. So all these like, you know, crazy amounts of sweetness, crazy amounts of, hyper palatable fat, pornography, all of these effects. And they're slowly decoupling us from, what we're built to seek. Or they're pointing us kind of towards these kind of commoditized versions of these things. Like pornography is your attraction to the other sex, but it's kind of it's just one part of it. It doesn't really do what it says it does. It doesn't lead to you having children. It leads to you spending more time in your basement or wherever the act takes place. And it's not it's I don't know. It's to me, it feels a little bit kind of almost apocalyptic and dystopian that this is allowed to go on in this, or even encouraged, because this is essentially economic growth. This is what our economy is based on: milking our brains for stimulus.
Yeah, I wrote this post for the Institute of Family Studies website. I think this was last year. Um, because I came across this interesting study on in Australia on jewel beetles, and basically what these researchers, these were biologists, they found that the population of jewel beetles in some region of Australia was dying out. And when they went to investigate, they found that the male jewel beetles were basically copulating with beer bottles. So whatever beer drinkers would leave their bottles on the ground, and the bottom of the bottles had these, it was like the color and the ridges and everything looked basically like a female beetle. And so the male beetles would just climb on them and, do their thing. And then they were sort of satisfied by that. And then they wouldn't sort of reproduce with actual female beetles. It was a sort of like supernormal stimulus, like you're saying. Um, and so in that post, I basically sort of drew this analogy to digital porn, where there's this thing. It sort of looks like the real thing. It's very very pleasurable and so on, but we're basically being hijacked. We're sort of being hijacked by this very alluring thing that's not real. And this may also be sort of one reason why the birth rate is declining, especially in developed countries, right, where you have access to all these things. I mean, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's such a new thing that I remember, I can't remember where I read this, but, and I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this too, about like why there haven't been more studies on this, on sort of the effects of pornography. Maybe there are some whatever political reasons, but I think like just practically, like just it's hard to do this because there are no young men who have never been exposed to porn. Um, it's just like you can't have a control group basically, right? Like you can't like, okay, this group hasn't watched porn, this group has, and let's see what happens or whatever. Look at their brain structure, behaviors, habits, whatever.
Yeah, the
Uh,
Amish maybe, but there is still Rumspringa where I'm sure they're loading up on porn that year.
that's a
But
good point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, if we can collect some Amish guy or like whatever, like if we can get some hunter gatherers or something. But yeah, I mean, just like in terms of like a convenient sample, you can't just go to a university and collect some men who haven't seen it, like basically every
no
college boy,
way.
right? And so, what do you like? How would you even study this? And yeah, I've seen like some very interesting data, for example, on sort of declining rates of sexual activity among young people. Um, I saw this stat on, so this was comparing 2008 to 2018, which is like basically the period of time when like streaming and porn and smartphones and all those things started to take off over those roughly 10 years or so. And something like in 2008, it was something like, I can't remember the specific, but it was around 15% of young men reported not having sex in the previous year. And then by 2018, it had basically doubled to about 30%. So we twice as many men now. Just like 30% is a lot, but yeah, twice as many young men have said like they're not having sex anymore. And for women, there was a slight increase. It went from something like 10% to like 15 or 18%. So it was like a noticeable jump, but not nearly to the same extent as it was for men. And I think like perhaps one reason is just because like on average men are more likely to watch porn and sort of fulfill their sexual appetites in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's also kind of almost overlapping with the rise of app dating, which kind of changes the landscape even more. And it's essentially kind of an extra liberatory layer to it. Like it really kind of pumps up the sexual liberation in the sense that, you kind of have a database of people that you can filter through the most superficial or kind of like just top line things that you're interested in. And if you're a woman and you match with a guy who matches your criteria, he will sleep with you under the ambiguous term of dating, but he'll probably not date you in the more classical sense, or kind of offer you the opportunity to have a relationship. So you see that the difference between how many women are having sex and how many men are having sex, that delta could also be explained maybe by the fact that some women are having sex with the same set of guys, which are they're not represented in that sample.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I've seen so I've seen the data on Tinder and on dating apps. I've even talked to some of the sort of chief product officer and some other people at Tinder, trying to understand what's going on with it. And I definitely think there's something going on here with uh, say like smaller numbers of men accumulating the majority of the matches. I see it even in my own sort of friend groups. I have a friend. He has a girlfriend now, so he's sort of settled down. We'll see how long that goes. But like he settled down for now. But for a while, he was going hard on Tinder. Like he had that like upwards of like 20,000 matches at some point. And Tinder identified him as like, I don't know, a prime user or start. I don't know. They had some kind of name for it, and they gave him all these perks and freebies and like I don't know, basically like doing whatever they could to keep him on that app because guys like that are the reason why women use the app, right? Like women aren't on the app to meet the 50th percentile man. They're looking for like guys like my friend, right?
This guy, yeah.
Yeah, and so they were like, whatever they were doing for him and lifting all these restrictions and doing all these things for him on the app to allow him to match with more women, and he got like really sucked into it. But then like I have other friends who are just sort of more typical guys. They're not bad looking; they're just regular dudes, but like they might get a couple matches a week, something like that. They of course like they tell me some of these girls will flake or like they don't meet up or whatever. It's just like it's much harder for them. Um, and then if you look at the actual data on Tinder, it basically aligns with this. Where so if I get these numbers right, it was something like uh, men will like 65% of the women that they see on Tinder. So basically, like the default for them is they will like the woman, they will swipe on that woman. Whereas for women, it's basically the reverse, where they swipe on 4 or 5%. I think I say actually 4.5% of the male profiles they see. So the default for them is like no way unless it happens to meet like very specific criteria. And so of course, like over time, that dynamic will play out such that those 4.5% of men will say dominate or sort of match or hook up with those 65% of women. And other research on this has been basically borne out where, there's that sort of 80-20 rule where what 20% of the men are sleeping with 80% of the women or something like that. Um, and so a lot of young guys, I see them, well, I mean, it's breeding resentment and anger, I think, on both sides. But, of course, most of my friends tend to be men. And I'm seeing like just more like, you know, I guess maybe this is somewhat counterintuitive, but the guys I know who are especially successful on the dating apps are the most cynical and the say like less, let's say, less respectful of women than you might want them to be. And the guys who maybe aren't so successful on the dating apps, who aren't really having much luck, um, they still have like a little bit of that naive optimism, but it's sort of for many of them turning into, I guess, more bleak outlook of like, well, maybe they'll never meet someone, and then some of them will retreat into like video games or porn or just like isolating themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of what this dynamic does, because I feel like it kind of creates this false scarcity of men in the app, where essentially because women don't really engage with the lower half of guys, and they see that they match with these guys that they really like. It's like, okay, there's these guys we can date, but essentially the dating is not necessarily, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It just means that, they will meet up with you. It's a Tuesday night, it might be a slow night, and then you get to go have a drink with this guy, and you're like, okay, I know what my league is now. And it's like, no, that's not what this is. And I feel like it's because there's essentially two markets interacting there. There's this market for long-term relationships and the market for sex, which are two different things, but it's all like under the banner of dating. We're all just dating here. So I feel like a lot of the women who kind of go through these cycles, they do end up a little bit cynical and a little bit desperate. So I'm sure that the guys, the more successful guys that you meet might be kind of rubbing up against these like kind of desperate women, and they're like, these girls, they're kind of weird, because they're weird by just the nature of the interactions that they've been having, because they're rejected quite constantly by people, and
Yeah.
they're antsy. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, like, yeah, that's yeah, I hadn't considered it from that angle before, but like, yeah, it totally makes sense to me why women would be sort of angry too from using these apps often enough, like seeing it from the male perspective. Like I know guys who like, some of them turn it into a game where they're like, how many girls from Tinder can I meet in one day, kind of thing, or like how many can I sleep with in this period of time from these apps. And if you're a woman, I could easily imagine that, like, hearing stories like that or meeting guys like that or whatever, like that's going to sort of give rise to some anger too. But we're all sort of stuck in a bad equilibrium, right? Because like if you're a guy and you're good looking and whatever, like that's like going to be the deep, like why wouldn't you do that? Like you can be told, like I've told some younger guys too, like it's going to be fun, but if you keep doing this, you're going to damage yourself. Like it's just going to happen. You're going to do damage yourself in ways that you don't understand. But if you're 21 and you're just looking to have fun, like of course, like there's no stopping them. And I guess probably the same thing for women too. And there's no like advice or like soft way of putting it such that people will just like listen and go along with it. Like the apps are there, they're available, everyone's using them. I think now online dating or dating apps are like the number one way people meet now, especially for like younger people. Gen Z and millennials are meeting people almost solely, it seems, through online, such that now it's things have flipped. I just old enough to remember when online dating or internet dating was sort of seen as weird. Like when it first came out, I've heard like read that it was like extremely weird, like in the '90s, to meet someone online. It was just a really weird thing.
Mhm.
And when I was like, younger, it was like kind of weird, but kind of okay, whatever. But now it's like it's flipped such that online or apps are the way you meet, and if you meet someone in person, that's the novelty, or that's unusual, or like that's sketchy. Like, you just met him in person, or met her. Like, what do you know about them? Did you Facebook stalk them or look them up on Instagram? Like, you need all that online information. Meeting someone in person is just, that's weird
Yeah, yeah. I almost remember the day. I can pinpoint almost the month where it happened. Like, I remember that there was kind of this expectation that if you go to like a club or a bar as a girl, someone will come and chat you up. But at one point, you could just see it became like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. People would just take out their phones and start swiping instead of looking around and start talking.
now.
And
Okay.
at the beginning, you were like, okay, have I lost it? I don't have the mojo anymore. But then I realized, people are just on their phones and just trying to sort this out in a more frictionless way. So it is pretty strange. And that was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I feel like that's kind of when it flipped in major urban areas. Like, obviously not. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, that's another aspect to it too. Like, I mean, I remember. So, when I started going out to bars, this is like the early 2010s. Um, Tinder, I think it was, created or established or whatever in 2012, and it didn't really take off until a couple years after that. So, like, I remember when there was like no Tinder basically, and smartphones were kind of a thing, but not really. And like, you could go to bars and meet people, and they would talk to you, and there was no, isn't there a phrase like, where people look at their phubbing, right? Like, phubbing, I guess, is like snubbing, but with the phone, where they look at their phone while they're talking
Oh,
to you. No, there was none of that, or very little at least. Um, and yeah, I remember, like, it was whatever. It was still like hookup culture. It was still kind of, gross or whatever, but like it wasn't as bad as it is today. And so I guess, like, one other, what I was going to talk about. So one other, component to this is that people are now, like, guys are now at least afraid of asking women out in person. Like, why would they take that sort of social risk and experience that in person, rejection, which is, unpleasant or whatever. Like, why would they do that if they could just, like, pull out their phone and talk to someone that way, and sort of like whoever they match with, at least they have that minimal level of like that kind of information of like, well, at least they think I'm attractive enough to match with me. Whereas in person, you don't really have any of that kind of information. It's less transparent. Um,
yeah.
I've heard some other interesting speculations too. Basically suggesting that, with the rise of the Me Too movement, and, I don't know, harassment claims and so on, Title IX on U.S. college campus, like, basically all of these things are instilling a sense of anxiety or fear among young men, such that, like, I don't want to ask someone out, and then that get turned into something else, and,
Mhm.
you know, ex-
Yeah.
face accusation. So instead, I'll, just use my phone.
Yeah, for sure. I've actually had a so-called radical feminist on the podcast recently, Louise Perry, and we were talking about the same thing. And I think she kind of traces this the issue of Me Too kind of back almost through the sexual revolution to this flipping in norms because back in the day, whatever you think about kind of regulated sexuality for young people, there was kind of you would kind of know what to expect. But now, because everything's liberalized and everything's kind of consent based, but consent is quite a fuzzy norm, especially in cases of inebriation or cases of someone likes you maybe more than you like them, you're friends, you're not friends, things like that. So things are very ambiguous at the moment. So kind of this deconstruction of standard norms or and replacement with no norms at all, except for this weird norm of consent, which means many things to many people. So I think I thought that was a really interesting point because it's like, okay, in a way, Me Too has a point, even if it's like the Aziz Ansari case. That was what we were discussing, which is a case where things were very very ambiguous. It was kind of an unpleasant experience, which was then kind of retconned into it was rape by some more extreme feminists and people saying, okay, this is it's not good, but people didn't really know what language to use to say it's not good. But essentially, it was like the only language they had was it was non-consensual, therefore it was rape. But it was these people didn't have the skills to negotiate this situation. She didn't know how to communicate with him. he didn't know what she wanted. So this total ambiguity is something that women are not happy with, but there's no language to describe it except for what weird like extreme feminists have left us with, like, yeah, everything is rape.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like that way that you put it, that we don't have the language to talk about it. I remember reading. I don't know if I read the whole thing, but I sort of skimmed it, and yeah, I mean, clearly something was going on there that was uncomfortable. It was awkward, whatever. But yeah, now I mean, it sort of makes sense in light of what you're saying, that just people didn't know how to express their disapproval for it or their discomfort with it, except for the sort of available cultural tropes that we have about consent or um, whatever, like assault or rape or whatever. Um, and I think that the lack of the sort of romantic and cultural scripts probably, I mean, probably those situations are happening every night, uh, and we just don't hear about it, right? We hear about Aziz Ansari because he's this big Hollywood star, but those like lower level, just regular people are going through that all the time. And there's probably, like, I would imagine, more like violence and more just domestic issues as a result of the fact that, like, people don't really know, like, how to go about asking people if they like them or how to sort of engage in romantic or sexual interactions
Yeah.
anymore. We're all just
And
sort of like
even,
fumbling.
yeah, it's like even this whole distinction between long-term relationship dating and sex dating that you have on the apps. I know a lot of women who are really kind of sad that they never end up in the long-term relationship camp. It's they kind of live in this ambiguous space in the middle. It's like, oh, okay, we're dating, but what is it? The what are we conversation. Is it cool to ask? Are we exclusive? All of this stuff is stuff that they would either like to ask, or they're really disappointed that it's not being brought up by the other person. A lot of like people stuck in like friends with benefits situations. If you're a woman, you're like, okay, I'm gonna put out, and so that maybe I'll be graduating to the status of girlfriend, and that's just like so a little bit of like psychological torture for a lot of these girls. And it's the ambiguity of the situation kind of promotes the fact that this is, yeah.
A while back, a friend of mine, he told me a story. When he was younger, he started dating this girl. Really liked her. She seemed to really like him. And after, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, he asked her basically point blank, like, "Would you be my girlfriend?" Which is like kind of unusual thing to do these days. Just ask someone that question. But he did. And she basically said, like, "I'm not really sure right now," and like they were like set to graduate college soon-ish, and I think like she wasn't sure where she was gonna go, he wasn't sure where he was gonna, that kind of thing. And so she's like, "Oh, I'm not really sure," like, so they kept hanging out or dating or whatever, but she did not agree to be his girlfriend. But so anyway, like, as sort of as the graduation date approached, um, and like they both knew that it was going to end soon after that, she started crying. And basically, from what I gathered, she basically said, like, he asked at the wrong time. Like, if he had asked 3 months after he asked, she would have said yes, but her feelings had not reached that point yet. But then 6 months in, it did. But then, of course, if he asks once and gets shot down, he's not going to like ask 3 months. Well, would you be my girlfriend now? Well, how about now, right? Like, he asked her once, she said no, and he was like, all right, so that's the status of this relationship, is just sort of hanging out and hooking up and having fun, but this isn't going to be serious. And that's where he was. Like, that's sort of where he settled. But she later on became displeased with it. So you know, those kinds of situations are playing out all the time too now, I think, where, like, as in the past, you would just ask someone and you go steady and they get married and whatever. But now it's like we never know where we stand with people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious what you think. Like, without explicit sexual scripts, without norms, whatever they should be, imposed by society. Is there any way of stopping society turning into essentially clusters of harems and a whole underclass of eunuchs or incels?
Well, what about, like, well, sex robots, or I don't know,
Oh
is
God,
that an incel
it's even
thing?
worse.
But well, as of right now, I'm at least short term kind of pessimistic about that question. Like, I just don't really see at least like bottom up, how this is going to change. Um, People, locally, individually, they're sort of doing what is best for them in their environment, and the apps are just like completely taking over. They're dominating now, and I don't really see this slowing down. I think it's also creating like easier ways to cheat too. Like in the past, if you wanted to cheat, like you had to like you risk like your social circle finding out, your friends, your family, like whatever. Like, but now you can like discreetly match with someone like one or two towns over, like, or even in the same town. Like I think cheating is going up now too because the apps have just made it so much easier.
We'll never know.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, yeah, fewer people are being honest. Although there are clever ways to get around that because, of course, if you ask people themselves, have you ever cheated? A lot of people are going to fudge the numbers, say. But if you ask people, if you think of your five closest friends, how many of them have confided in you that they've been unfaithful? That's kind of a clever way to get around this. Um, and I think like that number is going up. But you know, I hope that we don't end up in this sort of harem situation, that we sort of come to our senses and find ways around this. But hey, capitalism, free market, the whatever, the customer's always right. And I know people, like I mentioned this before, I know people who work in the app, and like they're not thinking about any of this. They're thinking about like how to get more people on the app. Like that's their goal. And like I don't know if I necessarily blame them. Like that's their job. But in the meantime, what can we do as individuals against like corporations that have unlimited funds and like super smart behavioral scientists who like sort of know how to get people addicted? So it's a tough question.
Yeah, yeah. This is I think one of the biggest questions I'm trying to kind of grapple with myself. I mean, I've turned quite trad in in my 30s, and now I'm married. I'm expecting a baby. I've kind of settled down in a very kind of chill location in my hometown in Eastern Europe. So, things are good on my end, but it's definitely not like a big cultural trend. Obviously, it's not ideal for everyone. Not everyone can do this. Not everyone has a small hamlet to return to. There's there's all sorts of layers to this, obviously, and I know it's not necessarily scalable, but there's also kind of a tendency for Zoomers, for like children who are like now teenagers and young adults, to kind of see through the kind of the sexual revolution, and they see the millennials having a bad time of it. And I'm curious what you think. Do you think there's going to be kind of a
Hmm.
deterrent effect, or will they just kind of pivot to something else like sex robots, or I don't know.
Oh, so just so I understand, so you're saying that the younger generation are looking at sort of people maybe roughly around our age and seeing like how tough it is for the sort of millennials, and they will sort of there'll be like a
Yeah.
pendulum swing.
Yeah, I mean, it
Um,
typically is, because you kind of had the 1950s were kind of a reaction to a more crazy flapper times, and there's always a little bit of an up and down. So I think now we're probably in for a correction for the sexual revolution. Obviously, with the pill, you've got a completely different landscape, but I'm curious to if you see that, or if there's any data. I don't know. This is just all anecdata that I'm bringing to the table here, but it seems like the Zoomers are a bit more, hmm,
yeah,
suspicious of all of this, of the OnlyFans and all that.
so yeah, I don't have any data off the top of my head on like whether there will be a sort of pendulum swing or if there is one, but you know, in the U.S. there's this what writer journalist Matthew Iglesias, who wrote this book 1 Billion Americans. I don't know, I haven't read the book, but I think like the broad strokes are something like basically we should open the borders and just like let 1 billion people into the U.S. and like promote fertility and pronatalism and so on. Um, and so like of course a lot of people on the right thought this idea was totally crazy, but there is a friend of mine, so Razib Khan, he's a geneticist. He actually likes the idea of opening the borders and letting people in because he thinks he thinks that American culture is kind of rotten, and that the only way to like whatever divert it or redirect it in another direction is with this massive exogenous shock. And so if you let in 1 billion people from whatever Brazil and India and Southeast Asia and whatever, like that would have like such a tremendous, like basically in that case the Americans would have to assimilate to their new culture rather than vice versa, where the immigrants would assimilate to American culture, which is basically what happens. So like right now, Hispanic, Asian immigrants, they tend to, the new arrivals in first gen, they tend to have their own sort of cultural habits, and they have a relatively high birth rates, and then their children and grandchildren, they sort of assimilate and then sort of match the native rates. um, but maybe we could maybe like flip it in the opposite direction, by opening the borders. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with it, but that is like one idea I've heard that might actually have an effect, and may actually, at least to some degree, be practical, because at least as of right now, the I think the pro-immigration sentiment is relatively high in the U.S.
Yeah, that's definitely shock therapy. Yeah, I think it might have some issues getting through even now with high pro immigrant sentiment. I mean, I haven't read the book, but I've heard Iglesias talk about it, and I mean, I do agree with kind of the pronatalist stance. I think you kind of have to because we've uncoupled ourselves from the biological imperative to have children. You kind of have to have a bit of an extrinsic motivation to kind of support people, or at least not make their life harder if they want to have children. So that part of the book I agree with. The opening the borders part, while also having a welfare state, which I know Iglesias supports as well, is going to be tough, mathematically very tough. So
Yeah,
uh,
well, I think the welfare, like, that just wouldn't be feasible. Like once you have 1 billion people, whatever kind of welfare state you dream up, it just wouldn't work. And so in that case, I'm almost like, well, maybe we'll. But
yeah, maybe if
yeah,
they
I don't
take the
know.
welfare state, I'm all for it. Yeah, that's
We'll see
like
what
my
happens. But
libertarian streak.
I get what you're saying though about the pronatalism argument, because like I've heard this from, I haven't seen any data, but I've talked to some psychologists about this, and some of them suggest that part of the reason why younger people are taking so long to reach adulthood now, there's even that phrase like adulting, where like whatever, like paying your bills and like whatever, just doing regular things is seen as like this foreign, strange thing of like, oh, that's what adults do, and it's like you hear like 26-year-olds talking that way. Um, but the conversations I've had, people suggest that one reason for this is because they don't have kids, right? Like in the past, like 26-year-olds had like families 40 or 50 years ago. Like it was just normal to like have a spouse and children, and like suddenly your life is not all about you, right? Like you have a bunch of other people to consider in your decisions. But now you have like people in their 20s and in their 30s, sometimes even in their late 30s, who have no children and have no prospects of having a family. And you know on average those people tend to be sort of more self-centered, less concerned with the future, and probably this has some effect on our politics, and on what kinds of things we talk about in the discourse.
Hmm. Is there like kind of an evo psych angle on why people are delaying, getting married, having children so long? Like why is this like prolonged adolescence? Um, yeah, I mean, I've got some theories floating in my mind with absolutely no data to back them up. So, I feel like people really want to keep optionality. Like that's kind of what I've seen. When I was living in the big city, being working metropolitan girl in tech. People just wanted to live that high option, high disposable income for as long as possible, and maybe they were a bit traumatized by their boomer parents who also had kind of a quite a libertine lifestyle, children of divorce. It just doesn't look very aspirational. If you've kind of been left to the side in someone's vanity marriage or things like that. So I don't know. To me that feels kind of maybe not. It's not the cause of everything, but it feels at least like it's a factor in the people that I know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I've seen any specific research on this question about like why people are delaying uh marriage. I mean, something related. I've seen, I think this was Douglas Kenrick. He's an evolutionary psychologist. And basically, he suggests, and so this, I guess, is sort of looping back around to luxury beliefs. His idea is that part of the reason why highly educated people tend to sort of support, whatever, sexual liberation and so on, is essentially because they stay in education for so long, right? Like, a typical sort of working class person, they graduate from high school, then they start working, and then from there you can sort of have a family or whatever. But, for the highly educated, affluent, upper middle class and above, you go to college and then grad school and then whatever, internships and so on. And then you don't really have your career going until you're in your like later 20s or early 30s. And, if you, of course, like someone in that environment or going through those steps, they're going to support premarital sex, right? Because no one wants to wait until they're 28 before they can finally have sex for the first time. And so highly educated people sort of champion sexual freedom, for somewhat selfish reasons for themselves. Uh, and, you know, perhaps this is sort of another reason why uh, childbirth and whatever, like why the birth rate is declining, because more people are going to higher education now. So at least in the U.S. context, in the 1970s, only 13% of Americans had bachelor's degrees, and now it's somewhere around 30 to 35% of Americans now. And postgraduate degrees is sort of following that same track. And so, of course, like as more people spend more time in higher education, um, spending more time preoccupied with their careers and where they're going to live and so on, like they're going to delay having a family for much longer.
Yeah, I've heard an interesting hypothesis about generations being being much more segregated from each other than they used to be historically. Like, you have children, being in kindergarten with people of kindergarten age, then in school, primary school through high school, same age, college, same age, master's, same age, PhD, same age. Then even when you go into the workforce, then you're like working at a startup. Everyone's the same age. Even at McKinsey, even the people on your floor are the same age because you haven't, graduated to go to the upper floor. So there's not really a mixing of people. Like back in the day, if you were like a mechanic or, you were doing, factory labor, you were with elders, they had families, they had children, there were kind of expectations baked into that whole situation. You knew what the next step was. You're going to end up like Bob, who's, a foreman, and he's got a wife and two kids, and that's what you should do. But now, if you're kind of like in this milieu where everyone, doesn't have a family because they're all the same age and there's no, what's a family? You should all just be working on the spreadsheet or whatever thing is in front of you.
Yeah, I remember this was a few years ago. Talked about this before, the Princeton mom letter. So this was, I want to say like 2013, right around that time. So basically, there was this. She was a Princeton alumna herself, but her daughter was attending that college, and she wrote a letter. I think it was like in the student newspaper. She wrote like an op-ed, basically urging female students at Princeton to find a partner like while you're there. Basically, like encouraging them because, I mean, her essentially like her argument was you're never going to be around so many young men who are worthy of you ever again, right? And so like she basically said like as you sort of move along your career, you're not going to have like this giant pool of promising young men. Uh, and the backlash she experienced was pretty severe. I even remember like I at that point I wasn't like super connected to like whatever media and culture and all that stuff. Like I was in the military back then, but even I remember hearing some talk about this, and basically like they called her like a traitor. I read about it more recently. She was a traitor. She's like I don't know, like a bad feminist or something. Uh, oh, are you still there?
Yes, yes, all good. I'm back. Can you hear me? Cool. So yeah, we had a little bit of a recording issue, but now we're back, and we're back with an interesting subject. Because I'm thinking about what we were talking about, the fact that the sexual landscape is quite changed. It's not as it used to be, and this is leaving a lot of men kind of disenfranchised, in the mating market. And there's this concept called the bare branches theory that I've discussed on a podcast with Vance Crow, and he kind of introduced me to this. concept. And it's essentially the idea that there's kind of a tipping point in each society where, if you have a certain amount of men who have no prospects, they're not going to be mating, they're not dating, not doing anything. It's kind of a geopolitical risk. Like, there's trouble brewing because you've got all that misallocated testosterone that has nowhere to go. I'm curious if you see that, if there's a possibility for this to turn sour politically, and is this something that we should be thinking about? Is it an option, or is everyone too numbed out by porn?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Like I've heard of that theory before, but my understanding is that it's somewhat contentious. I've heard other people or other researchers. I remember even reading a paper about this where someone did some analyses on, I don't know if it was China or somewhere else, but basically indicating that like surplus men do not necessarily or inevitably lead to more violence or whatever. Like, and in fact, it can sometimes go in the opposite direction, such that like in so like yeah in societies where the gender ratios are such that there are more men than women, there tends to be more monogamy and less instability, simply because like the men are modifying their behavior to become more attractive to the relatively fewer women. Um, but yeah, I mean, like both of those sort of intuitively make sense to me. In the Western context, like I don't know, like I don't really see, uh, at least from what I've seen in like the statistics, like it does seem like within the last year, violence has increased, homicide has increased, but a lot of that has to do with like the political movements going on in the U.S. and I guess to some extent in Europe as well. But broadly speaking, the patterns of violent crime have been declining since the '60s, which has been interesting. And I think like perhaps one reason for this could be basically like you said, like numbed up by porn. Like guys just don't really feel like going out and whatever peacocking and showing off anymore. They just sort of are content to hide away in their whatever their parents' garage and look at their laptops or play World of Warcraft, and sort of get their whatever their masculine thrills in those simulated realities of fake war through video games and fake porn, fake sex through digital porn. Um, but it's just odd to me like how this incel meme has spread so much. I mean, there have always been young men who have been overlooked in the dating market, but it's just now becoming this cultural trope. And what's interesting to me is that I know guys who are not incels in terms of the technical definition, meaning like they either have girlfriends or they're actively dating and relatively successful, but they share a lot of those same kind of like cold, cynical, uh, whatever, just kind of like unpleasant views about relationships and women and monogamy and so on, that I've heard from like this sort of these incels or whatever. Like there's a lot of overlap there. So I don't even know if you can draw a straight line from, oh, if you don't have sex, then you become this sort of bitter and cynical person who hates women. Like I think there's something else going on. It's not just the sex; it's something else in the culture that's giving
Mm-hmm.
rise to
That's
these
that's
kinds of
really
feelings.
interesting. Like I do have a feeling that all of this kind of red pill MGTOW incel knowledge is seeping out of these forums, and it is kind of sad because it's kind of like really concentrated, and it's really kind of catalyzed by a lot of rage in these formats. But the problem, I think, is that no one else is talking about this stuff, and no one else is trying to be honest about gender dynamics. And these guys have a point. They really thought about this stuff, and they might be full of rage while they're typing out their rants, but it's quite informed by reality many times, which is not the case with, like, if you open up GQ and ask them to give you some advice on your dating life. It's all going to be absolute bullshit that has nothing to do with reality. And then on the next page they want to sell you $5,000 shoes or something. So I think it's a fraction of reality that people get, but I think the packaging is suspect. I'd love for men to get good information, but maybe with less. vitriol packed in.
Well, so I definitely think like the vitriol that comes with a lot of that advice is contributing to, some of this bitterness. But you know, like you're saying, so some of this advice isn't it's not necessarily wrong. Maybe it's flawed, but in terms of like, does it do the thing that you want it to do? Like, if men were to sort of adhere to those things, does it help? And a lot of it does. And sometimes I think that can be sort of a problem in itself. So a while back, I remember reading this interview with a comedian. It might have been Jerry Seinfeld. I can't remember who it was, but basically, this comedian said the reason why he changes up his routine every so often is because, as a comedian, if you tell the same joke and make the audience laugh, over time you start to lose respect for the audience. Because you sort of view them as whatever puppets or something, like, oh, I say these words and they laugh, and you do that often enough, you lose respect for them, so they have to change up their act. There might be something similar going on here with, like, some of the guys who go out and use these red pill tactics or whatever, and find that some of them actually work, and they use them over and over again and find that more often than not maybe it works. And I think that, like, that too can have this sort of effect of like losing respect for the person with whom you're interacting. uh, and this too, I think, ties into this notion of, like, in a completely free, open sexual marketplace, um, those feelings too will sort of flourish, right? Where you can interact and hook up with as many people as you want and use whatever sort of consensual tactics you want, and if they work, uh, then over time maybe this also breeds this sort of worldview, this lack of respect or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, it's really interesting to look at also kind of how people are socialized, and kind of how our society is trying to solve the problem of young men. And I think one of the things that we've defaulted to recently was to just kind of say, okay, men should not have aggressive impulses. These aggressive impulses are toxic, or they represent something that we don't want to include in society. We need to kind of teach men to not be like that, and then kind of socialize them like girls. And if they depart from the girl as standard meme, there's something wrong with them. And I feel like we've been doing this for what 50 years, and or maybe more so, depending where you're from. Less so in Eastern Europe. We've just started here, but it's I think one other person I had on the podcast, and one of my favorite Twitter posters, is Zero HP Lovecraft, and he has this really cool metaphor that the pickup artists rediscovered essentially what it is to be a man, and they're selling it to guys, kind of the manly man, essentially the guy who's like really confident, who doesn't take no for an answer, is has this dominant warrior expression, because essentially that's what PUA is. It's like being confident and manly, and negging and stuff like that. It's just essentially kind of the outward signs of confidence, and it's essentially kind of reverse engineering manliness and teaching it, by the piecemeal, by the phrase, to guys who have never been introduced to, kind of old school Marlon Brando style manliness. They might have heard about it, heard echoes about it in the culture, but it's never really been, given to them on a plate saying, okay, this is what it is to be a man. They've just kind of told, you need to sit down, take your ADHD meds, and shut up. So, it's I think it's a really interesting way to look at it, and I think that there's something to it.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about. So I read that the pickup memoir, the Game by Neil Strauss, a few years ago, and if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that book, Strauss says something like, you know, uh, a lot of these guys, whatever, like the gurus or the teachers, were like these sort of father figures to a lot of their students, and some of these students, they either they weren't raised by their fathers, they didn't have their dads around, or they did, but their dads were just sort of like absentee or just didn't teach them anything, and so now these sort of like, I mean, Frank, like, at least from what I gathered in the book, maybe it's different now, but like at least in the book, like some of these guys were pretty weird, and like, at least from my perspective, they weren't like that, like, manly. I don't know, like a lot of them were like recommending wearing kind of odd clothing, and like kind of the ways that they were talking too didn't seem particularly masculine to me. But these guys were searching for some kind of like male mentor or father figure or something, and those guys stepped in to like fill that role, and of course like they were selling sex, which young men are interested in. But I do wonder, like, as fatherlessness has more and more become the norm, and not even necessarily like physically absent, but just sort of like men who like masculinity as it's sort of on the decline, and so even if you have your father around, he's not necessarily like a strong masculine presence in your home. They then guys will sort of find other ways to seek it out, and go to YouTube, and like, yeah, of course, like, lots of people have written about like how Jordan Peterson has sort of fulfilled that void for a lot of young men who are looking for masculine male mentors. And to me, that makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely. I mean, it's if you do look at the POA community, there's quite a an interesting cast of characters there, and some of the tactics are a bit exotic, but it is it's kind of like what we were talking about, like supernormal stimuli. Like most men will not act like that, and in a way, if you have someone who will act counterintuitively, like by peacocking or by being out there and or saying something completely ridiculous to someone in a strange situation, that's kind of like a costly display in a way of confidence. Like, who the hell would do that? So in a way, if you're the kind of guy who can't really just show up and beat his chest and be Conan the Barbarian and just throw a woman over his shoulder and take her home, maybe you just kind of have to you have to wing it with some crazy shit, and then and then women be like, "There's something about this guy. I love his Hawaiian shirt.
Right.
Why is he wearing that? Yeah, just confuse her, and then you can take her home, maybe."
You know, I so a couple when it was like a month ago or a couple months ago, I posted this video on Twitter. It was an old ABC spot. This is like back when ABC was a little bit more edgy, and they did this whole like episode focused on the challenges of being a short man. And it was pretty rough. Like essentially, like whatever, they'd have like focus groups of women through like a what is it, like a one-way mirror, or like men were lined up and then women could see them, and basically say like, I would never date the short guy in that group. Some of the comments on my Twitter feed were pretty, some of them were kind of rude, but like some of them were actually pretty funny. One guy suggested, actually more than one, said that if you're a very short man, what you basically have to become Al Capone, where like you better go like wear like a custom suit, like wear like bling, like have like develop a reputation for violence. And if you're a very short man, like that is a way to sort of capture the attention of women. You sort of almost have to signal the opposite of what your sort of stature would suggest. Um, yeah, so like maybe there's something like that going on, but sometimes I see people share other things on Instagram and social media and stuff, like screenshots of like negative interactions or like dunking or whatever on dating apps. Um, and I wonder if like this is also sort of breeding this kind of cynicism too, and this like I don't know if the signals are going to work anymore. Like you're saying, like if you're a guy, you're just like this massive asshole or whatever, and that's sort of following that handicap principle of like who would do this. But if like Instagram and all these like social media apps are like sort of sharing all of these tactics publicly of like, can you believe what this guy said? And like a girl posts it, and then it gets 100,000 likes or whatever, and those tactics become just generally widely known. I wonder what the effects of that will be. Like if guys will continue to ramp it up and become like even more, unpleasant, or if they will go in the opposite direction to distinguish themselves and become super nice. Like there's always these signaling games, these signaling spirals that play out, and I'm curious how guys will
Yeah,
react to
I think
this.
it's probably much harder to do game on an app. Like, you really have to crank up the Photoshop and I don't know, wear lots of feathered hats in your photo set. But yeah, I'm sure there's a way to do it. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, I feel like a lot of these PUA guys have kind of been left out in the cold by apps. Because they've been training to do face to face interactions with women for so long, and then actually everything's moved on to the internet. Good luck. So it's I don't know, it feels tough.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. I mean, what are the ways to like what would be the techniques or the tactics to like maximize success in something like this. Like the thing is like with the apps, like a lot of the strategies, I guess, like these are things that women have known for much. Like so basically, apps have placed far more importance on appearance now. Like at least in the past, you could sort of like get to know someone and maybe your personalities would vibe or whatever. But with the apps, it becomes much more about appearance, which of course like women have a lot of experience with that, and they already know like how to take good photos and lighting and angles and all that stuff, filters, and guys are less familiar with that. I've seen there are now websites where you basically like I guess it's sort of similar to like hotornot.com back in the day where like you can post photos of yourself and strangers will rate it on like various different dimensions, like not like the big five personality, but basically things like how intelligent do you think this person is, how attractive, how sociable, how interesting, and people can just put up like 5 or 10 photos of themselves and let people rate them on all of these dimensions and then choose the best one. So I'm seeing like yeah these kinds of like different forms of optimization for the apps, and yeah I as it becomes more looks driven too, I think this will also start to like maybe leave more like men and women, maybe more so men, but like women as well, like sort of out in the cold, because of course like people want the most attractive person they can get. Interestingly, like this just brought a study to mind, study on online dating in which the researchers, I can't remember exactly how they calculated this, but they basically found that on average people message and attempt to like start conversations with people who are 25% more attractive than themselves. That's sort of the average of like people want someone who's realistically in their league but slightly better looking, slightly more more desirable than themselves. And I've suggested that one reason for this is because is based on other research by social psychologists in which they found that if you sort of take photos of people and you manipulate some of them to be slightly less attractive, like 20% less attractive and 20% more attractive, and you show the 3 photos to people, the less attractive, the actual photo, and the slightly more attractive photo, and you ask which one of these was the actual picture we took of you, people overwhelmingly choose the 20% more attractive photo. That's who they think that they look like. Is they think they're slightly more attractive than they really are. Um, and I think this is maybe partially why they're going for someone who's slightly more attractive, because they actually think like, of course, that person is who I should match with because I'm a little more attractive than I really am. So I think that's also something that's going on too, and this leads to inevitably disappointment because we usually aren't as attractive as we
Oh,
think we are.
that's quite the black pill. I think I'm just as attractive as I think I am, but I guess, yeah.
These are just averages, averages.
Yeah. Well, before I let you go, I want to ask you the question of the show. I have a question of the show, and it is: do you have a thinker or a writer or a person that kind of influenced your thinking that you think deserves to be more widely known? Some a subversive thinker, maybe someone who's kind of informed your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are so many, people who've influenced my thinking over the years. Um, I'm trying to think of someone more obscure that maybe your listeners wouldn't have heard of. Um, Off the top of my head, like the thing is, like, so the guy I'm thinking of is Roger V. Gould. He was a Yale sociologist. He died at a pretty young age in 2002, but he wrote this book called Collision of Wills. And the basic, the sort of bumper sticker or tweet version of this book is that when like as status becomes more equal between individuals, the likelihood of conflict increases, which is sort of counterintuitive from what you would think. And that idea has informed a lot of my thinking over the last couple of years. So the book's Collision of Wills. I don't know if it's out of print, but it's definitely worth checking out. I wrote a sort of whatever summary of this for City
Yeah, that's
Journal
super
last year.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, when you said it, I was like, equality, but when you think about inequality, you think about like money inequality. That's not status inequality. And then essentially you kind of have status being a zero sum equation. And then you just have like these minor status frictions between all of these equal people. That's really interesting. Yeah, super, super cool.
Hmm. Yeah, I think even for economic status equality, something like that might, depending on the context, even something like that might increase the likelihood of conflict too. But yeah, that idea was just totally floored me the first time I'd heard about it and sort of
Yeah,
did a
it's
deep
super
dive.
counterintuitive. Like, it's definitely not the Marxist lens, but it's quite
Mm,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, my website is robkhenderson.com. So Rob, letter K, Henderson, and Twitter's the same,
Cool.
Rob K.
And
Henderson.
the newsletter. Please sign up to the newsletter. It's really good. It's fun to read, and it's always kind of jaw to the floor type of realizations every time I open up your newsletter. So it's quite good.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thanks,
Thanks so much for
Alex.
coming on.
Yeah, sure thing.